Hello and welcome to the channel, my friends. It's Thunderbob here, and tonight we are going to talk about a franchise that is very close to my heart. Resident Evil. This is a series that has basically been there from my earliest gaming days. A series that has grown with me over the years, reinventing itself with each new release and with each new generation. Of all of the game series I have enjoyed over the decades, Resident Evil has the most impressive release cadence, while also maintaining a very high level of quality, with just a few missteps over the years. I've been playing these games at release for nearly 30 years now, but I've come to realize that while I've replayed a few of the games many times, like Resident Evil 4, there are a few that I've not played since that original release date many years ago, and there are at least two mainline games that I never actually completed. So my plan is to replay every mainline release in the series, including all of the numbered titles and the remakes. And I'm going to throw in Code Veronica and Revelations 1 and 2, even though it's debatable if those are mainline games. I'm going to play through the games in release order, and then put together a review and retrospective for each game individually. I intend to contrast my memories and feelings playing these games originally, years and decades ago, against how the games hold up today. I'm going to play through these games on the PC where available, and for the older titles with graphical mods to try to play these in the best possible light today. When I'm done with the entire series, I want to do a final video with my overall thoughts on the series and a ranking of all of the games. And a warning here, there will be some spoilers, but let's go ahead and get started. And tonight we're going to discuss Resident Evil 0. This is a 2002 prequel that tells the side story of Rebecca Chambers before her involvement in the original Resident Evil. Capcom had long considered a prequel to the original, and this game was originally envisioned as a Nintendo 64 DD game, but with the failure of that system it was changed to a standard Nintendo 64 cartridge. But as the generation came to a close, it was upgraded to the GameCube system, and was eventually released the same year as Remake, actually just a couple of months after Remake. I remember playing this after completing Remake, but before Resident Evil 4, and having mixed feelings on the game. Going back that far, my memories are a bit hazy, but I do remember that I really enjoyed the start of the game. The train setting in particular is one of the strongest in the entire series, but as you get deeper into the game, the locations were less appealing. I also remember the game being quite tedious, and there was a lot of backtracking caused by the decision to remove the item box from the game. I got stuck quite a lot, and I nearly gave up. I remember I kind of walked away from the game for a couple of months, but I do remember returning, and turning my GameCube on today affirms the fact I actually did beat this when I was a kid. I don't have a lot of specific memories on this, but I do remember an overall feeling of frustration at times. You know, I really loved Resident Evil Remake, and this felt like such a pivot from that nearly perfect remake. Now let's jump ahead 22 years or so, and I'm playing the Resident Evil 0 PC HD remaster, and the game just really looks beautiful. It even looks better than the Resident Evil Remake, as they were able to recover the original textures in this case, and everything just looks really, really sharp. The train in particular is really impressive, with some great lighting and shadows and all the moving objects. It looks really spectacular, and if it was released today, I would still be impressed. This was the final game in the series to utilize the fixed camera angles, and they really leveraged that here to make the game just really outstanding graphically. Now, the game largely plays the same as Remake, with the same tank controls and fixed camera angles, with just a few exceptions. And this is the game where they started to experiment with having two characters that you could swap on the fly with just a single button press.
Follow me.
Okay.
You could also tell the other character to follow or stay behind, and also instruct them to fight or stay idle. It's closer to Shiva from Resident Evil 5 than Ashley from 4 in implementation, but at times it feels quite clunky. Also, each character has 6 inventory slots. So in theory, you have 12 between the two characters, which is more than any previous entry, but the game also has some weapons that require 2 item slots, such as the larger guns, the hook shot, the shotgun, the grenade launcher. The game also did away with item boxes, but allows you to drop items anywhere, and they would show up on your map to be able to find them later. The problem is you don't necessarily know when you need an item, so it leads to an incredible amount of frustrating backtracking. So I got frustrated by the lack of item boxes pretty early on during my new playthrough. I was leaving items on the ground around the train, near the save room, and I was getting error messages because when you put too many items on the ground, the game doesn't have any more space to put new items down. And it's so clunky. You pick an item from your inventory, you tell it to drop, a pop-up message, there's nowhere to put it. You close it, you move it. It's just the most frustrating thing. And what I ended up doing is actually, for the PC, there is an item box mod that adds an item box into the typewriter. And it makes it so that you can save items to any typewriter and access them. It's a little bit cheating, but you know what? Sue me. This changed the game completely for me. This went from being one of my most disliked game in the series to actually being enjoyable with just this one little change. And I would recommend, if you are at all frustrated by this component of the game, the lack of item boxes, the lack of inventory, use the item box mod. It will just make the game better. Now let's walk through the structure of the game here. You start out the game as Rebecca Chambers. You don't get to select your character like some of the previous games. Rebecca is a member of the Bravo team of the S.T.A.R.S unit that was lost prior to the beginning of the original Resident Evil. Your unit is attacked, and you run, and you wind up on a mysterious train. And you start to explore, and quickly you find out that the train is swarming with zombies. You run into Billy Coen, a former Marine who has set to be executed for the murder of 23 individuals, and that is until his transport crashes nearby. This is when the co-op gameplay begins and when you can cycle back and forth between the characters. So soon the train is moving, and you need to find a way to stop it and escape. You explore a bunch of the cabins, a kitchen, you even climb onto the roof of the train a few times. You fight this weird scorpion boss that's super easy, but it takes an incredible amount of bullets to actually finish him off. There are puzzles where you need to take each character to separate ends of the train and activate the brakes. This causes the train to crash, and you end up at the training facility, which is essentially a duplicate of the mansion from the original game. There are some differences, but the look and the way you explore and the feel and vibe of the environment feels just very, very similar to that original game. You explore a few levels of the mansion, you solve puzzles, you avoid zombies, you fight a giant centipede boss. There's a lot of bug bosses in this game for some reason. The game introduces these giant grasshoppers called plague crawlers, and also leech zombies, which are super annoying, and I mostly try to avoid them. You eventually make your way into the basement. You run into spiders, which again, mostly I try to avoid. The game introduces infected monkeys known as eliminators that are very, very aggressive. Eventually you make your way to an observatory, where you use the 3 tablets that you've collected throughout the training facility to open the way to the laboratory. This leads to a really beautiful outdoor area with a cathedral, and you fight a giant bat monster, and here is a spot that I remember long ago playing as a child, getting stuck. You know, I was here for quite a while. I think this is actually when I fell off the game for a couple of months, and I didn't return to it till sometime later. This time it went a lot easier. I took the bat down on my first try. And you need the hookshot again to reach the roof of the church and proceed. And if you're not using the item box mod, you're probably doing a lot of backtracking, as you might have left it all the way back at the train at the beginning of the game. You explore a laboratory that feels pretty different from the labs in the previous games. It feels a lot older and more rustic. Looks like something from like the 60s or 70s. And Rebecca and Billy get separated for much of this area, and you need to use a conveyor system to transfer items between each of the different playable characters. And by passing those items back and forth, you're able to unlock the doors and return the characters together. Now, you find a cable car, but when you start it up, you get attacked by eliminators again, and Billy, falls off the tracks, and Jill must continue on alone. This leads to a really beautiful outdoor area with a cathedral, and you fight a giant bat monster. And you eventually make your way into the basement, where you find a giant grasshoppers called plague crawlers, which again, mostly I try to avoid. The game introduces these giant grasshoppers called plague crawlers, which are super annoying, and I mostly try to avoid them. The game also introduces the You reach a factory, and you're only here for a pretty short amount of time. You ride a turntable down, and you briefly stop at what appears to be the exterior of the lab from Resident Evil 2. I'm not sure how this makes sense in a geographical sense, because wasn't that under Raccoon City, and this is supposed to be in the mountains? So I'm not sure how that exactly works. You fight a prototype tyrant, but he went down without even attacking me back. It was really easy. And then you make your way down to a water treatment facility, and you spot Billy, but he is dragged away by the currents. And you eventually reunite again, and you have a second fight with the tyrant. You end up needing to separate here to solve a few puzzles on separate ends of the facility, but eventually you meet back up, and you make your way to the final boss, the Queen Leech, who reveals the grand plan in a very Bond-like villain moment.
And the world will burn in an inferno of hate.
You'll pay for what you've done.
We'll see which one of us is gonna die.
And it turns out that Marcus, a co-founder of the Umbrella Corporation, was assassinated by Spencer. But one of the infected leeches found the body and regenerated him into the Queen Leech and made him young and beautiful for some reason. It's kind of weird. The Leech Queen then attacked the train and the training facility as a means of revenge on Umbrella, who betrayed him. This is pretty silly even by Resident Evil standards. Then, after 2 fights with the Queen Leech, you manage to escape. You salute Billy goodbye, and you wander towards the mansion from Resident Evil 1. Dun dun dun. So this game feels a bit experimental. Up to this point in the series, I would say this is the game that takes the most risks in trying to change the formula for better or worse. They were toying with new concepts like switching between characters, removing item boxes, the ability to drop items on the ground, and many new types of enemies. The problem is nearly every one of these additions feels like a misstep in my opinion. Switching between the characters can be cumbersome and doesn't really make the puzzles or combat better, and ends up killing a lot of the atmosphere and feeling of isolation from the earlier games. Overall, the character switching just feels tedious. The staple of the Resident Evil games from that era is that you don't necessarily need to kill every enemy. Sometimes there is a hall you just want to run through. Now with 2 characters, you basically need to park one character while you run through with the other to a safe spot. You switch to the other character and you do it all over again. It just makes everything feel like it takes twice as long. There is also some limited AI, but even if you turn off the AI combat and you run through an unsafe area, there's a high chance that the other character is going to get stuck and won't follow you through the door, and you're going to need to cycle back and forth. It's just a very frustrating experience. The lack of item boxes and dropping items on the floor is good in theory, but because you have no way to know when items may be needed, it causes a lot of backtracking. And also, just interacting with the inventory and the items on the ground is just incredibly clunky and slow, and it adds to the frustration. The gameplay and the combat in this game are nearly identical to Resident Evil Remake, except you have a second character to either help or to control. The problem is a lot of the new enemies are more annoying than scary. The leech zombies just take way too many shots to take down. I'm talking a dozen shotgun blasts. The leech zombies are easier if you use fire, but it still will take 3 Molotov cocktails to actually take them down. When you compare them to the regenerators from Resident Evil 4, that's one of my favorite enemies that they added throughout the series. And I consider them just about the most terrifying enemy. The noise they make and everything, just like a very scary vibe to them. But the leeches in this game and some of the other new enemies, they're less scary and just more annoying. It's hard to explain, but they're such sponges for ammo, and it's easier just to avoid them altogether. They're not all that threatening if you just run around them. Yeah, I just don't really love a lot of the added enemies in this game. Another example is the Eliminators. They don't take quite as many bullets to take down, but they are very aggressive. There are times where you'll open a door and there's 3 Eliminators rushing you, and sometimes you'll get attacked and stun locked before you even have time to react. So overall, even though the controls and the gameplay is nearly identical to Resident Evil Remake, which is maybe the high point of the series, here it's just not as fun because of the babysitting aspect of having the two characters, and just the overall more frustrating enemies. There's also only a limited amount of replay value in Resident Evil 0. There are 2 modes after you beat the game. One has you replaying and collecting leeches that will help you unlock things like infinite ammo. And there's also a second playthrough where you play as Wesker, who has a ton of crazy powers, making the game very different. Still, it feels like there's less reason to replay than Resident Evil 2 and the different campaigns you can select in that game. The puzzles here aren't bad. Overall, they're reliant on the switching mechanic a little bit too much. There's lots of situations where you pull a lever with one character, and that will unlock something across the room which you need to grab with another character. Or sometimes it's across a map where, like on the train, there are braking systems on the very front and the very back of the train, and you have to get there within a certain amount of time. It's fun the first time, and then when they do it 15 more times before the end of the game, it gets a little bit tiresome. And that moves us on to the locations, which are a mixed bag here. You know, the beginning of the game, the train, it's pretty incredible. It's one of my favorite locations in the entire series, but it's only like 20% of the game. The majority of the game takes place in other locations, in particular, the training facility, which is nearly identical to the original game. And it's incredible when you think this game came out like 4 months after Resident Evil Remake, and it takes place basically in the same type of environment. After that, you've got laboratories and factories. It's all very rote and feels so very familiar if you've played the previous games. And the only really unique thing here is the train, but there's just not enough of it. Another huge failure for me is the story. It just doesn't work for me. The villain is essentially this anime wannabe guy who just feels very out of place in the series. It comes across pretty silly, and it doesn't even have the fun cheese factor from the earlier games in the series, but rather it takes itself way too seriously. The villain is also largely absent from the game except for a few cutscenes, and then he shows up in like the last 2 minutes of the game. Beyond that, the characterization of Rebecca feels pretty odd here, because by the end of the game, she's the zombie killing machine. She knows a lot about Umbrella, but then when she shows up in the original Resident Evil, it doesn't feel like the same character. She doesn't have the skills or the knowledge that she learned in Resident Evil 0. The other character, Billy, it doesn't feel like they really give much backstory to him. There's like a 30-second flashback that I think implies he was involved in a war crime, and I don't think he ever shows up in the entire rest of the series. So did he ever make it out of the Arklay forest? It's kind of confusing. But overall, the story here, it doesn't work for me. It reminds me a bit of the Star Wars prequels, where they try to shoehorn in a bunch of unnecessary connections to the sequels, and it really just complicates the narrative. I think it worked better with a more simplistic backstory. You don't really need this, multiple Marcus and Spencer and assassinations, and he came back from the dead. It just kind of muddies the waters, and it doesn't help the overarching narrative of the series. So I kind of come to the end here. Should you play this today? Is it worth playing in 2025, 2 decades after the original release? And overall, I enjoyed the game, and especially with the item box mod, I think it goes from being perhaps the worst mainline game to just a middling one. But I think you can skip Resident Evil 0 unless you're intent on seeing the entire series. This is the final fixed camera game in the series. It probably is the best looking, but in my opinion, this is the first large misstep in the series. And even with the item box mod, it's still clunky and frustrating. They try so hard to make the story matter in the larger canon, but if anything, I think it weakens the later games. The location outside of the train are entirely forgettable and redundant with the original game. The enemies and bosses are more annoying than scary, and I don't think I would call any of the Resident Evil games bad, but this is overall one of the weaker titles for me. And of all the games I've played so far, it's my least favorite. And with that, I'm going to sign off tonight. I do appreciate everyone that has watched my videos in this series in particular. If you have any thoughts, please drop me a comment down below. If you like what I'm doing, like, subscribe, and just keep an eye out. I'll have another video up probably next Friday or so.